This is From Now On. I'm Lisa Phillips. Just a heads up, this episode contains discussions of sexual assault, and some listeners may find it upsetting. We also encourage listeners to prepare themselves emotionally before listening. Welcome to From Now On, where we explore the complex and often heartbreaking realities of human behavior, trauma, and healing. Today, we're confronting a harrowing truth that many endure in silence: why predators often target the most vulnerable among us. These predators aren't just looking for any victim. They deliberately seek out those who are already burdened by life's challenges. Whether it's a young person navigating the fragile period of adolescence without guidance, someone grieving the loss of a loved one, or an individual isolated from the support they desperately need. These vulnerabilities make them prime targets for manipulation and exploitation. The trauma inflicted by these predators doesn't end with a single incident. Instead, it often sets the stage for a lifetime of compounded abuse and traps victims in a cycle of suffering. But why does this happen? And why do these already vulnerable individuals so often find themselves trapped in an ongoing nightmare of abuse? And more importantly, how can we begin to understand and support those who have endured such unimaginable pain? As we explore these questions, we'll also take a closer look at the 5 stages of grief that victims of sexual trauma commonly experience. And like the grief associated with loss through death, the grief following sexual trauma is a unique and often misunderstood process. It begins with denial, a place where many victims, including myself, can find themselves stuck for years. For some, it's a year or 2, some 5 or more. For me, it was 15. It wasn't until the death of my abuser that I was finally knocked out of denial and thrust into anger, the second phase. And let me tell you, the anger was fierce, growing more intense with each survivor I spoke to, each story that echoed my own. Then came bargaining, the endless replay of events in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. It's a stage that traps many, where we question every moment, searching for a way to rewrite the past. For some, depression follows, a heavy weight that drags them down as they struggle to process the overwhelming reality of their trauma. I didn't experience it in the traditional sense, but I know the feeling of being utterly overwhelmed, lost in the sheer magnitude of it all. For me, weekly EMDR therapy has been my lifeline, helping me inch toward acceptance, not in condoning what happened, but in finding a way to process it and store it in a safe place, so to speak. And that's crucial, because if we don't face this trauma head on, it manifests in ways we can't control or even understand. Speaking out, as terrifying as it is, strips the predator of their power. Silence gives them control to keep hurting others. Remember, predators are drawn to those who are vulnerable, those who haven't fully healed. I want to pause for a moment to clarify that being vulnerable isn't inherently bad, whether it's shaped by life circumstances, familial context, isolation, or genuinely choosing to see goodness in everyone. It's not bad. Vulnerability in relationships is necessary to build trust and accept support. But abusers manipulate it. They can sense it, and they exploit it. This is why so many of us find ourselves caught in one abusive relationship after another. My abuser may be dead now, but there are countless wannabe Jeffrey Epsteins out there, lurking in the shadows. Let me tell you a story about one. When I began speaking out in 2020, I had no strong family support, no partner to stand by me. I was utterly exposed, and predators could smell that vulnerability a mile away. One of them even reached out to me after seeing me in a documentary about Epstein. All my friends warned me that it was really odd, a red flag that someone would contact me because of seeing me on TV for that topic. But I was in a hopeless place, just wanting to be around someone who cared about me, to show me the kindness and love I craved during that very difficult time. For 4 months, he pretended to be that person. He said he was a Christian man. He read me daily Bible passages, devotionals. He became my best friend, my only support. I trusted him. I just wanted to be near him. So during the pandemic, I went to stay in his state for a few months. When he finally had me alone and trapped, he revealed to me his true intentions. He tried to abuse me in the exact same way Epstein used to. It's almost like he was thinking, it's already been done to her. The seal is broken. That moment changed my life forever. The nice, charming, sadistic sociopath posed as my shoulder to cry on, all the while plotting to violate me. And he did many times until I could get away from him. It can be terrifying out there. An abuser is already anticipating how they will abuse you. They groom you by saying the exact words you need to hear, buying gifts, fool you that you're safe with them so that you deeply trust them. They're always a step ahead of you. And you don't have to be 19 for predators to target you. That was the most chilling realization of my life. A wake-up call that I needed to heal from trauma so I could start aligning with healthy, supportive people. For the past year, I've been doing everything I can to ensure I'm no longer vulnerable to anyone like that ever again. That realization was a driving force for me to speak out. There are people out there that see you, want to trap you, hurt you, and ruin you. It's only when we stand up and speak out, even if it's just to a trusted friend, and acknowledge these patterns that we can begin to break free. I promise you, change is possible. In this episode, we're not just examining the patterns and psychology behind these predatory behaviors. We're giving voice to survivors, shedding light on their experiences, and discussing the profound emotional and psychological impact of sexual trauma. This conversation is vital, not just for understanding, but for creating a pathway to healing and empowerment. Today's guest is a retired hospice nurse, a former classically trained actress and dancer, Playboy's Miss September in 1963, a former Playboy bunny at the first Playboy club on the Sunset Strip. In 2020, she became the oldest woman to pose for Playboy at 77. She's also an author, speaker, activist, and a multi-rape, child, and domestic abuse and sex trafficking survivor. Since 2014, when she went public about being a Bill Cosby survivor, she's been working to educate about rape culture, lobbying to change laws that give the power back to survivors to seek justice against their perpetrators. Currently, she is directing She Wrote, a tribute to the sister survivors of Bill Cosby and to all survivors of sexual violence, a play she wrote that premiered on July 21st, 2024. I am honored today to welcome Victoria Valentino to From Now On. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So, Victoria, in November, it will be 10 years since you went public about your assault. As you reflect on these years, what has been the pinnacle of your activism, and what has been the most challenging aspect of going public?
Well, that's a lot. I think the pinnacle was, well, it's multifactorial.
Mm-hmm.
One of the high points, of course, was we formed a coalition that abolished the statute of limitations on rape and sexual assault in California in 2016. We lobbied, testified, and rallied in Sacramento, and the law was passed into law on the 1st of January 2017. It wasn't retroactive, so it didn't help us who had been assaulted prior to that. But from that moment forward, all victims of sexual assault could seek tangible justice.
Wow, and how did that feel?
It was triumphant, and we had such a strong sisterhood. And I think that was another pinnacle. I mean, there were several peaks in 10 years. The first one, of course, was finally finding my voice and being able to talk about the dirty details, which I had never talked about. I had always just made snarky comments, wouldn't let my kids watch Cosby's show. I would change the channel if his face came up, or I'd walk out of the room and I would infer that he was a schmuck and that he wasn't a nice person. But I never told anybody the dirty details because I couldn't face them myself.
Mhm.
You know, they
It
were
was confusing for you.
well, you know, you feel so mortified and so
Mhm.
humiliated, and
And not even ready to speak out.
well, yeah, it came to a head finally on November 22nd,
Mhm.
2014. Back in 2006, I think, when Andrea Constant first accused him of drugging and fondling her. And there were many Jane Does, which I never knew about. I was on my way out to work, and my daughter was standing with her morning teacup watching CNN. And she said, "Mama, look at this." And there was this story that this woman, I didn't even know her name at the time, had accused Cosby. And I went, and we both looked at each other and we said, "Oh, that's a pattern."
Mm.
Because at the time, I thought I was the only one.
Mhm.
And of 62 plus of us, the majority of us also thought we were the only one. So that was a revelation.
Mhm.
But in 2006, I wasn't ready to deal with it.
Mhm.
I was working as a nurse, and I was also hosting and producing a radio show on Pasadena City College campus. And by the time I really processed everything, somehow it had all gone away.
Mm.
And I felt like I had been saved from having to deal with it.
So as
And
they spoke out, you started to think that it's not my time right now, and I don't need to speak out right now.
well, you just don't want to dig up the
Yeah, you don't want to
past
dig it up.
because you'd move forward.
Mhm.
And when you dig up the past, then you have to experience the whole thing again.
Yeah, you
And
have to be very truthful with yourself and acknowledge that it actually did happen.
yeah.
Mhm.
And there was so much fallout. I was under contract to Capitol Records to do an album, and I had fought for a long time to get to that place.
Mhm.
And it was this gift because I was already a multi-rape survivor. I was a trafficking survivor. I was a child abuse and domestic abuse survivor.
So how many years prior to this was that?
Let's see, I managed to escape my first husband, who trafficked me and abused me when I was 21.
Mm.
Just before the Playboy Club, the first Playboy Club on the West Coast opened in December of 1964. And it was such a traumatizing experience for me. I was 19 when it began, but I had also been a rape victim in New York when I was away at school in my senior year of high school,
My goodness.
which I had also never talked about. And I had been accused of being a bad girl in New York away at school by my family because I couldn't talk about it. And so, you know, all my adult life, they promoted this reputation that was false about me because I never told anybody.
Right.
And this is classic
It is.
for rape victims. You just can't talk about it.
No.
And then something happens, as happened to me in 2014.
So what did happen where you felt confident and empowered to start to speak out?
I'm not sure I felt confident or empowered
No.
in that moment. I was just getting ready to go to bed, and I was shutting down my computer, and the Yahoo News on their homepage came up, and I saw this woman, Barbara Bowman, who was saying, "Hey, I've been disbelieved for 35 years." And I went, "Oh, I can't deal with it." And I was pushing it out of my consciousness again. And then all of a sudden, this thing came up with Hannibal Buress,
The
a
comedian.
male Black comedian, making a joke about it in a stand-up routine in a nightclub in Philadelphia. And suddenly it went viral.
And then everybody knew about
And
it.
that was my tipping point. When I saw that a woman hadn't been believed for 35 years, but it took one man making a joke about it, and suddenly everybody believed him. And that just pissed me off so much. It was like this little red rocket of anger just exploded. And it just went zoom, and my head blew off. And then I started thinking, who can I talk to? Who can I talk to? And I started thinking of all the different people I knew in show business who were journalists who worked for, People magazine or this. And so I started, on the computer, and I just sent out this kind of spray of, hey, I was drugged and raped by Bill Cosby in 1969 or 70 maybe, because I couldn't quite remember. I knew it was the end of 69 because I was walking underwater after my son died. And I was so traumatized already that I had lost a sense of time. And
so what happened during that time when you were grieving? What happened with Cosby?
Oh,
But
gosh. Well,
take us back to that day, maybe.
I had to for several years because I didn't have any job skills. All I knew how to do was act, dance, sing, look pretty in front of a camera. So as far as having a regular job to take care of my son, I just didn't have, and minimum wage was $2.03 an hour. So
But you had gotten a recording contract.
So I suddenly got a recording contract after several months of having to do B movies just to pay the rent.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. So getting that contract was just a gift from God, really.
What kind of music was it?
Well, I was a folk singer. It was the 60s, It was all about folk music, and it was all about protesting Vietnam and civil rights and acid, Summer of Love and all of that stuff.
Everything was going good. You were really happy during this time.
Well, I was really still bouncing off a lot of depression because what I hadn't dealt with was all of the PTSD, which hadn't been yet identified. So I was ricocheting off of a lot of emotional pain and not identifying it and not having any backup or support. So
you're acting happy on the outside, but on the inside, you were going through a lot of turmoil.
Yeah. And so I was, I had this contract, but, when you're traumatized and everything has not gone well in the past, you're always living on the edge and going, but anyway, my music attorney, he wanted to marry me, and he was giving a party at his house up in the Hollywood Hills to celebrate the successful negotiation of my contract and to announce our engagement.
Oh, wow.
And my little boy, who had just turned 6, drowned in his swimming pool at the beginning of the party. It changed my life. I died in that moment with my son. And I never married him. I walked away. I couldn't ever go back into that house because I could never see that pool again without seeing my son face down at the bottom of the deep end, and he couldn't understand that. My parents were blaming me for my son's death. And my girlfriend, who was one of the first chocolate bunnies, she was my training bunny at the Playboy Club it was December of 64. And she said, I see what's going on here. Come home and live with us. So I did. And I was just a crazy person in her house, and she just let me be crazy and organize people to take me by the elbow and take me places and just let me be. And then I was running out of my advance money from Capital, so I needed to get a job, but I was really incapable. At the time, I could pick up a couple of bit parts in, movies and stuff because, you can parrot somebody else's words, but to go into the studio and sing your own music when your heart has been ripped out of you and your music along with your heart, and you go into the studio to record and you just kind of stand there and you open your mouth and there's nothing left to sing about,
Right.
you know? So she said, I know Bill Cosby. You know, all of those comedians used to play the Playboy Club circuit.
And you were pursuing acting at the time?
Well, yeah, I was a Screen Actors Guild member already.
Okay. Oh, great.
I had become a SAG member in 1966.
That's a big
for
deal.
How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Anyway, she said, I'll call him. I'll get you an interview. And she did. And I showed up at the gate, and they, instead of directing me to an audition hall, they sent me to his trailer, and he met me wearing sweats. And I handed him an 8x10 of my son that my girlfriend had said, as I was walking out the door, she said, here, take this, show Cos this. He'll appreciate it. He was really kind to me when I was in trouble. And so he took the picture and he sat down and he just looked at it and looked at it. It was like he just spaced out. He was hypnotized, mesmerized by my son's picture, because my son was looking directly into the camera. And of course he was biracial. So now in retrospect, I'm thinking that he was reflecting back on when he was maybe that age, and because he was an abused child.
Oh, he was?
Yes.
Yeah.
Out of control, violent, alcoholic father. So I just started, blah, 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 you know, talking, because there was so much silence. It was making me nervous. So I was telling him giving him my resume, basically telling him what happened with my son, everything. And he just, like that. And finally I got so nervous that I just stood up and I grabbed my son's picture and I said, thank you very much, and got out of there. And I think that's what saved me that day, because only recently have I discovered that he assaulted a 14-year-old in his trailer. So I think that was the plan originally, but my son's image
It could have been, and then he could
saved
see
me.
that you were in a vulnerable, you know,
Well, because he
position.
targeted people who were vulnerable.
Yeah.
So when I left, I never really thought I'd ever see him again. So a while later, my roommate and I went to the Cafe Figaro down on Melrose and Doheny, which is no longer there. And at the time, we didn't know that he was an owner. And we were there having a little glass of wine and some onion soup and hot bread. And I was having a rough day. I was grieving and crying, and I couldn't stop crying. I mean, I was just convulsively crying. And you know, with grief, it just hits you in waves. I mean, you kind of like go through the day, and then all of a sudden it's like a horse kicked you and you double over, and there's just nothing you can do until you cry it out. And that's when he walked up to our table.
And did he recognize you from?
He knew my story already, and he was mesmerized by her eyes. She had these kind of pale white blue eyes, and he used the knowledge of my grief to get to her. And he put her in charge of me and said it would do me good to go get a massage, go to the spa, and then he'd send his car over to the house and take us to dinner. And you know, in this business, it's not how talented you are. Sometimes it's also who you know.
Yes, who you know, the relationships.
And so it seemed like it was a gift. And he was, you know, he was being very compassionate. So even though I didn't really want to get wet, I wanted to go home and curl up in a fetal position in my bed. We went along with it, and, you know, we went to the spa, and then she called him, and he sent a car over to my mom. We were living at my grandmother's house in West Hollywood, because my grandma had died 3 weeks after my son. So it was grief on grief. And so we went over to this restaurant next to the whiskey, and she was a vegetarian, so much of their conversation was what could she possibly order in a steak restaurant, and I was sort of sitting, on the tail end, and it was clear that it was
they had a thing.
their thing, and
Right.
I was just the excuse.
Mm-hmm.
So I was sort of playing with the food on my plate and just waiting until, dinner was over so we could go back home and I'd go back to bed. And I had a boyfriend. She had a boyfriend. We were all living together in the house. And he put a pill down next to my wine glass and said, "Here, take this pill. It'll make you feel better. It'll make us all feel better."
Mm-hmm.
So I was guilted. And in those days, everybody was taking diet pills. That was what all the club managers were giving everybody because it would keep us on our 3-inch heels for longer shifts and keep us more cheerful and keep our weight down.
So is that what you thought it was?
Yeah, because I would never take a downer.
We also don't question it
I
'cause-
never did that.
Right. So it's like something's gonna make me feel better. Okay, fine. I trust.
So I kept thinking, yeah, I could feel better.
Right, of
Definitely
course.
feel better.
Mhm.
And so I took the pill, washed it down with some wine, and then he reached across and stuck a pill directly in my mouth.
The second pill.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
And he did the same with her, but then he pretended like he was taking a
Of
pill.
course,
It's
I'm
like,
taking
oh,
one
pill
too.
party, Pretty soon our faces were in our plate. And I said,
Mhm.
I need to go home. And he said, "Oh, I'll take you."
Of course.
Took us out to the parking lot and his driver was gone. And I asked, "Where is your chauffeur?" And he said, "Oh, we had something else to do,
Mm-hmm.
but I'll take you."
So his car was there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he took us, but he didn't take us home. He took us up in the hills to a place he said was his office. He wanted to show us his awards. And
yeah,
I
but
was
you're
in
both out of it.
I was in the back seat rolling around and I had spinners and I was trying to keep myself from throwing up in his car. And
Mm-hmm.
she was in the front seat all hunched over, rolling around.
Oh my
and,
goodness.
just terribly. I was so sick to my stomach and it felt like my face was, this far off of my face. You know
Mm-hmm.
how you get that cold feeling, and it was awful. And all of a sudden he just stopped and pulled us out of the car and took us up to the second floor of this building that he said it was his office so that he could show us his awards.
And what was in
And
the office?
well, it wasn't a working office. It was obvious as soon as he opened the door. It was just this little tiny thing with 2 love seats and a little writing desk and one of those fake French provincial phones. But he
That's
had
so
an I
strange.
Spy poster framed on the wall, And she went over and sat down on one of the love seats and keeled over and passed out.
Oh,
And I
gosh.
sat down on the one that was parallel to the front door and put my head back. And then everything got really silent. And I don't know how long I was out, but the silence woke me up. And I thought I had been left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of panicked and looked around. And he was sitting next to her, close to her hips, and looking down on her like a hawk.
Ooh.
And it was really obvious.
Like predatory.
He the way he was looking at her,
Mhm.
you knew what was on his mind. I mean, it was so obvious. And then you saw the bulge
Oh, well, that gives it
in his
away.
pants, so it was pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I panicked. And so I started trying to distract him so that he wouldn't rape her while she was unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And I would try to say words and it came out of my mouth garbled.
Wow.
It was whatever the drug was, it
Mhm.
was just, I couldn't talk.
So what were you thinking in that moment?
Well, I was just trying to distract him so he wouldn't rape my girlfriend while she was unconscious. That's all I could think of. I kept thinking if I distracted him, he'd lose his whatever,
Right, but she was completely out of it.
Yeah, she was curled up on her right side, and basically almost in a fetal position. He was sitting like his hips were pushed up right next to her hips.
Oh, okay. So you knew something was going to
Yeah,
happen.
I mean, he was sitting there looking like he was conjuring up the inspiration, and as we have learned over the years,
Yeah.
his passion is triggered by having women unconscious.
Yeah, and that's what's turning him on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's called Sleeping Beauty syndrome.
Is it?
It's an actual syndrome. So after I distracted him, finally he got angry and he stood up and came towards me, and his face had changed.
What did it look like?
He looked violent and angry.
Wow.
And I had already suffered a tremendous amount of physical abuse from my son's father.
So you knew that energy. You knew.
Yeah, very
Mhm.
well. And my father,
You don't forget that energy.
you
Mhm.
know, I knew my Sicilian father. He was a tyrant. He was the mellowest guy in the world, but when he got triggered, he would explode like Vesuvius, you know. And I know that change in what happens next. You know, they explode on you, you know, and the next thing you're flying through the air and, you know, they backhanded you and whatever. So when I saw that, I stood up because I didn't want to be sitting down. I stood up and then my knees were rubber and I just went to collapse and I just grabbed onto him to keep from falling. Next thing I knew, I was on my knees and he was unzipping his fly, and then he stood me up and bent me forward. And that was the other fetish that he had. Even with women that he had consensual sex with, he always had to have them facing away from
Oh, wow. You couldn't look at
him.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
After
says a lot right
62
there.
women and learning all the stories, you know, there is a definite pattern
Yeah,
of,
there's always a pattern.
you know, certain fetishes. Yeah. So after he was done with me, threw me back like trash on the love seat and went to walk out the door. And I said, how do we get home? You know, I don't even know if I was understandable. And he didn't even look at me. He just looked disdainfully at the fake phone on the desk and said, call a cab. And he slammed out of there.
Ugh.
And so I staggered over to her and shook her awake. You know, come on, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. And she came to, and then we staggered over to the phone. How do we call a cab? We don't even know where we are. And then we thought, well, maybe if we call home and her boyfriend could figure it out, you know, what we should do, because we're still so drugged. We went to pick up the phone, no dial tone.
Wow.
And so she said, oh, it must have come out of the jack. So she got down on her hands and knees, was crawling under the little writing desk, and there was no jack. It was a prop phone, and it was one of those cloth cords that was cut.
That's scary.
Yeah. So he knew it was a prop.
Wow.
So then we thought, what are we going to do? So we staggered out, and we were going to take the elevator down, and then had this terrible thought of, like, what if the door opens and he's in there and then we're trapped again? So we found the stairwell and we clattered down the stairwell down onto the street, and we were up in the hills and we could see the jeweled lights of the city. I mean, it was light. It was daylight when we went up there, and then it was dark when we left. And, you know, so we started running downhill, you know, we figured sooner or later we'd get someplace we recognized. And she got out to the strip before I did. And there just happened to be a cab passing, which is highly unusual in LA. You know, in New York, it's, you know, par for the course, but not in LA. But he stopped, and we got home, and her boyfriend was waiting at the front door, and we just kind of burst in, and, you know, we were all crying and blah, 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 blah. I don't even know what we said. And he put his arm around her, and they went off to their bedroom, and I went to the back bedroom, which had been mine when I was a baby with my mom. After that, I became very suicidal, and I walked away from everything. I walked away from my recording contract. I walked away from my family, my career, my hometown, and I just threw everything in my car, and my son's dog, and my guitar case, and I hit the road.
Wow.
And I went
right after that event.
It took about 3 weeks,
Wow.
maybe
you were
a
done.
little longer. the house broke up. She and her boyfriend broke up, and they went separate ways. And my boyfriend caught me trying to slash my wrists and slap me in the face and threw me on the bed and screwed me very violently and threw stuff in his duffel bag and left.
Wow.
So I was suddenly alone in a house, and I
So
didn't have a job, and I was damaged, and I couldn't
that
work,
is
and
so
I couldn't afford to
traumatizing.
keep the house.
Right.
So
Oh, you've been through so much.
I left. And my producer and his wife were living out in Topanga Canyon, and they found a room for me in a neighbor's house. And so I went out there, and I was there for about 9 months.
Were you still pursuing your career?
No, I was a crazy woman.
After that, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wandering the hills with my dog.
And so how old were you at this time?
I had just turned 27 in December of 69.
Okay.
Yeah. So at my age now, I look back on it, and with all of the judgments that I have of myself, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And then I look back, and 27, I was a kid.
Right. And yeah.
I was a kid.
That wasn't the time when women spoke out about those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And who would believe you?
No, they don't believe you. You're ashamed. So you experienced a lot of trauma in a condensed amount of time during a time when therapy, trauma, PTSD wasn't really talked about. What were the first steps you took on your journey to process this trauma and to finally heal a little bit?
Well, the first step was before I walked away from Hollywood, from my house, I realized I needed to find out who I was before the trauma. I had to go back into my life and say, who were you? Who was that little girl before all of this crap happened, you know? And all I could remember was playing in the woods in Connecticut as a child and being content in the woods. And I thought, that's where I have to go. I have to get back to nature, because if I don't get back to nature, I'm going to die. And so that was what triggered me throwing everything in my car and hitting the road and going out to Topanga Canyon. And it did save my life, although that first year I was so traumatized that even though I was in nature, I was doing a lot of self-destructive things, you know, driving too fast around curves with a jug of hard cider at my heels, and, you know, mainlining cocaine, and, you know, and just having very destructive relationships, because you're destroyed, and you don't feel that you're worth anything.
Yeah, you're worth anything, yeah.
And you're not really ready to actually take a gun to your head, so you do all these other things that you're teetering on the edge of self-destruction. And maybe if it happens, okay, but you're not ready to actually do it to yourself yet, completely, you know. But it's a form of suicidal ideation.
Well, it took me almost 20 years to feel ready to share my story.
I believe that.
Yeah. And for you, over 40 years.
45.
45 years.
Yeah, I think it was 45 from 2014, from 1969 to 2014, yeah.
Well, I'm a big believer it doesn't matter how long it takes. When you feel empowered to share your story, and sometimes seeing the other survivor sisters out there sharing too.
Well, I think once you find out that you're not alone.
You're not alone, exactly. Because sometimes you just think it's just your story. Or for I deserved it. This happened to me because of other past traumas or things that you were going through. But when you see that's happening to so many other women, the exact same MO.
Exactly. You know, if you feel already worthless because perhaps your parents didn't value you, and told a different story about you than the real story of who you were, you don't have anything to live for.
Well, the predators, they know that.
Oh, they smell it.
Oh, they sniff it out.
Yeah,
They always can tell when you're
They can
sensitive and
tell.
vulnerable,
Yeah.
and okay, you're the right one.
And then you wind up sticking with people
Yeah.
who are predators and who are abusive because
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of all of that, they're still the only ones who say they care.
Mm. That's why I said it's confusing.
Yeah.
Because in the way that you still look up to them or care about them, but they're also abusing you. So it's
Yeah.
like a very confusing
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't
Absolutely.
understand that.
Absolutely. It's very difficult. Very difficult. When people say, well, why didn't you just leave? They don't understand that there is an entrapment, a psychological, emotional entrapment that imprisons you.
Yeah, they work very hard to make sure that
Yeah.
you're happy most of the time, but then
Yeah.
abuse, right?
They speak sweetly to you and tell you all of these things. I remember when I tried to escape and my son's father caught me and beat me up for 3 hours, broke my front tooth. I'd just gotten my braces off the year before.
Oh my goodness.
And beat me until I was becoming delirious. And I just started crying for my mommy. And all of a sudden, that was the thing that snapped him out of it. He just stopped. And he took me in his arms and started rocking me and just saying, you're not a child. You're a woman. You're the mother of my sons. You're not a child, you know? And it was like suddenly he became this nurturing person. As
It's
if,
so strange.
you know, it was like you changed channel 2, now you're on channel 4.
Yeah, you go from
was
beating
like-
you to just caring for you and nurturing you.
Yeah, suddenly. But then he jumped me. He knocked me down. I was slipping into unconsciousness. I was in his arms and he threw me on the bed and then raped me as I was slipping into unconsciousness. Well, you're just entrapped. And a
Yeah.
normal person with normal psychology is hooked in that web
Yeah.
and you don't understand it. And so when they say, but I love you, you're the mother of my sons, you know, and you get drawn back into it for a nanosecond, and then they do the next destructive thing to you, and you're unconscious, and you're, you know, bruised and bloody and,
Wow.
you know, broken teeth, and, you know, but now they've drawn you in, you know.
So
And
what
now
made you finally have those boundaries where you're like, I'm not going to take it anymore? When did it finally just...
There's not one thing that creates a boundary. It's a process. You know, the healing process is like peeling an onion. You know, there are all these different layers, and you have a moment of aha, got it, and now you think you're well, and then you hit the next layer and you go, oh, maybe not. You know, and then you have to work through that. And try to understand that.
So maybe writing your memoir, was that a healing process for you?
It was painful. It was probably the deepest therapy. I've written that book for 20 years, but it didn't come into the form that it is in now until after I went public about Cosby. I never could finish the book. I would always hit the wall at a certain point.
Because you hadn't found your voice yet.
Because that was the missing thread that pulled it all together in a complete package, in the pouch, you know. And I had never addressed it. So therefore, I never completed.
Well, putting it down on paper makes it really real.
Oh, yeah. And even when I first started writing the book, I was never completely addressing all of I didn't go back and tell all of the abuse from my father, from my husband. I didn't tell all that story. I didn't talk about the trafficking. And it wasn't until my good neighbor, who's not even a professional editor, when I thought the book was finished, I took her down the hard copy and I said, hey, Courtney, just read this. I think I'm sending it to the publisher now. And, you know, just read it. Tell me what you think. And then I didn't hear from her the next day. And I went, uh-oh. And so I called her. I said, so did you have a chance to look at the book? She says, are you kidding me? I stayed up all night and I read it. And she said, I'm coming down to the house. And she came down, brought some Prosecco. And
Ooh.
she said, "Don't hate me, I love you, but this is what you need to do."
Oh.
And she watches a lot of movies. She says, "I took it all apart and I've put in a whole new arc." And it was that arc
Mm.
that was a cinematic arc
Mm-hmm.
that forced me then to practically rewrite the whole book and tell all of the grisly, dirty
Yeah.
details about being trafficked,
Right.
about the abuse from my childhood and my first husband.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what heals others, is knowing
Yeah,
what you went through and how to overcome it.
yeah. But you're still, no matter when you start telling a little bit of the story, you think, okay, I've done that. You dipped your toe in the water and you think, well, that's plenty. Who could possibly tolerate listening to all the other stuff?
All right.
And you don't want to revisit it.
No.
You
So is
know?
that what She Wrote is about? Your play that's about to premiere?
Well, the play, oh my goodness. I got the book published and I thought, okay, now I'm done. Now I'm just going to rest for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So this one journalist, filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, Emily Watson, formerly with the Huffington Post, was out here on vacation and we had stayed in touch. She had interviewed me years ago. And she'd been talking to me about, I'd really love to make a documentary about what happens after Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought about it, and then we got busy, both of us doing other things. And she was out here on vacation. We were having lunch, and I was telling her about this idea that I had that had just kind of come down from the ether.
Mm-hmm.
And she just said, "You want to film it?" And I went, "Yeah."
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it was born.
Mm-hmm.
So she and I are working together. She in New York, me here. I'm doing the play. She's filming it, making the documentary, not just about my play, but, of all of the people around the movement and
Mm-hmm.
what are we doing and how are we taking this trauma and where are we going with it?
Right.
Laws being changed and now currently the rug being ripped out from under us with Roe being overturned and all the things, all the rights that my children and you never lived without are now being stripped.
Mm-hmm. So there are some people in our audience who are in the thick of an abusive relationship. What would you say if you could speak to them?
Well, you have to believe in yourself and you have to know that it's not your fault.
Yeah.
And you have to find a way to get out safely because many deaths of women trying to escape abusive situations happen at that moment when they are getting free.
Yeah, about
because
to be
the
free.
abuser wants to, keep that control. So you have to find ways to get free. And you have to call the police, You just have to do it.
Yeah, as many times as it takes, right?
Mm-hmm. You have to do whatever it takes to get out of there. And there is hope on the other side. There's always light at the end of the tunnel. You really do have to get through. And a black actor by the name of Rupert Cross, who was one of John Cassavetes' troupe, he won an Oscar for his part in the movie The Reavers. And he was an old friend who helped me find the courage to escape my first husband. He would call every day.
So a good support system.
Yeah.
It's very important.
And if my husband answered, he would pretend, of course, that he was calling to speak to him. But he would say to me, pardon the language, but this is what he said, and it really helped me in my healing process. He said, once you're out, once you're off the shit pile, he said, you're still going to stink for a while. He said, but don't think it's yours. He said, in time, that will go away and you'll come out smelling like a rose. So every time I would have all of that doubt and trauma and, just couldn't get out of bed, so depressed and wondering who I was and was it all my fault.
Mm-hmm.
Rupert's words would come back to me.
Yeah.
And it really helped me to realize that all of the awful stuff still clung to me, but it wasn't mine.
No.
And
Not
that
anymore.
over time it would fall off my shoulders, fall off my heart, fall off my head.
Yeah.
And I would, come through it okay.
We like to end every episode with this question. When you hear this statement, from now on, how would you end it?
From now on, I want peace. I want to spend time doing peaceful things. I want to do art. I want to focus on creativity. I want to be in my garden. I want to paint. I want to do just more assemblage art. I make Buddha boxes.
That's cool.
Which are sort of like shadow boxes, but decoupage and stones and different things. And I want to spend more time with my grandchildren and be a living memory for them when I'm gone.
I like that. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and please do come to my play.
Yes, I'll be there.
Yes.
We've only scratched the surface on Victoria's story. Please check out her book on Amazon, Dirty Diamonds: The Repurposed Life of a Playboy Icon and Cosby Survivor. This is From Now On. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Lisa Phillips. Special thanks to our guest, Victoria Valentino. Elizabeth Wyndham is our senior producer, Christopher Leon is the editor, and Jose Oriana is our studio producer. Our theme music is Many Worlds by Memory Theory. If you have any thoughts, questions, or stories about your own views on topics discussed on From Now On, email us at fromnowonpod@gmail.com. And please follow, rate, comment, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If today's conversation resonated with you and you are seeking more support in your own healing journey, if you or someone you know has been sexually assaulted, help is available. Call 800-656-HOPE. If you or someone you know is being trafficked, contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Text 233-733. That's Be Free. PAVE is a 501c3 nonprofit creating a world free from sexual violence and building communities to support survivors. To learn more, go to shatteringthesilence.org. Speak Out, Act, Reclaim, SOAR, is dedicated to providing a safe and empowering space for survivors of sex trafficking to reclaim their stories and stand up for themselves and each other. That's www.speakoutactreclaim.org.